Canada spans nearly 10 million square kilometers, yet almost no one lives across most of it. While cities along the southern border thrive, more than 90% of the country remains nearly empty, cut off by brutal climates, ground that shifts with every thaw, and costs that soar 1,000% higher than anywhere else. Why did an entire nation's population turn its back on so much land, and at what hidden price? The answer begins where most people would never dare to call home. Across Canada's vast sweep, the land divides into 15 ecozones, each shaped by climate, soil, and the rhythms of daylight. The Boreal Shield, Boreal Plains, and Taiga Shield together stretch over 70% of the country, where conifer forests give way to open tundra and the growing season shrinks to a handful of weeks. Northward, the Arctic ecozones begin, dominated by permafrost and the low stunted vegetation. Here, the frost-free period can last less than 30 days each year. In contrast, the southernmost reaches, around cities like Toronto and Vancouver, enjoy more than 150 frost-free days, supporting dense forests, farmland, and the majority of Canada's people. The hardiness zone map lays this out in color bands, with zones 0 to 2 filling the high Arctic, where only the hardiest shrubs survive, and gardening is impossible. Zones 7 to 9 hug the American border, where the climate is mild enough for orchards and vineyards. The further north you travel, the shorter the growing window becomes, closing off opportunities for agriculture and even basic gardening. In many northern communities, the ground remains frozen for most of the year, and the soil thaws just long enough for a flush of wildflowers before winter closes in again. Daylight, too, swings to extremes. In summer, towns above the Arctic Circle see the sun circle the sky without setting for weeks. By December, daylight can shrink to just a few hours, or vanish altogether into polar night. These cycles shape every part of life, from the timing of construction projects to the logistics of food delivery. With so little warmth and sunlight, plants struggle to root, and the land resists permanent settlement. The biological limits are clear. Where the seasons are short and the sun is scarce, the land itself sets hard boundaries on who can stay and thrive. Permafrost covers nearly half of Canada's landmass, about 2.2 million square kilometers stretching from the Arctic archipelago down into the northern boreal forest. Permafrost is a layer of soil that stays frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. In these regions, the ground is laced with ice that does not simply melt and vanish in summer. It holds the soil together like glue. When temperatures rise, even by just a couple of degrees, that glue begins to fail. Over the past 20 years, ground temperatures at 4 meters depth have climbed more than 1.2 degrees Celsius in northeastern Canada. In Nunavik, more than half of the permafrost terrain has disappeared since 1957. For engineers, this spells trouble. Every building, road, or pipeline must be designed to cope with shifting, thawing ground. Standard southern construction techniques collapse in these conditions. Foundations can tilt, roads buckle, and entire neighborhoods are put at risk. To counteract this, builders use specialized solutions, deep piles driven into the ground, adjustable supports, and thermal siphons to keep the soil cold. These are not optional upgrades. They are the baseline for safe construction, and they come at a steep price. A permafrost scientist says this: "You are not just building on soil, you are building on a block of ice that is starting to melt." In practical terms, that means cost multipliers. Infrastructure in permafrost zones can cost double or even 10 times as much as similar projects in the south. A typical home in the Inuvialuit region may require $20,000 to $100,000 in foundation adaptations alone. For public works, the Northwest Territories projects $1.3 billion in permafrost-related costs over the next 75 years, about $51 million every year, just to keep existing infrastructure standing. As the ground warms, these numbers climb. Thawing permafrost does not just threaten buildings, it destabilizes the financial foundations of entire communities. Every kilometer of road, every school, every health center north of the tree line must be built and rebuilt with expensive, climate-resistant engineering. The price tag for living on melting ground is measured in billions, and it is only getting steeper. Canada's surface transportation network reveals a sharp divide between the densely populated south and the vast, sparsely settled north. The country's total road length stands at just over 1 million kilometers, but only about 40% of that is paved. The vast majority of these paved routes cluster below the 60th parallel, tracing the southern corridor where most Canadians live. North of this line, paved highways become rare and often end abruptly, replaced by gravel roads, winter ice roads, or nothing at all. The National Highway System, considered the strategic backbone for freight and travel, covers less than 4% of Canada's total road mileage and is overwhelmingly concentrated in the southern provinces. Railways follow a similar pattern. Canada's rail network, once the engine of national expansion, now stretches roughly 25,000 kilometers, with nearly all major lines running east to west through the southern third of the country. Northward expansion never materialized on a large scale. The few rail spurs that reach into northern Manitoba or Quebec serve mining operations or small towns, not broad settlement. For most communities north of the 60th parallel, the nearest train station is hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. This southern bias in ground transportation shapes every aspect of daily life. Groceries, building materials, and medical supplies move efficiently along paved corridors in the south. But in the north, the lack of permanent roads or railways means that basic goods must take longer, more expensive routes. For many northern communities, the end of the last paved road marks the beginning of a logistical challenge that only gets steeper with distance. The infrastructure gap above the 60th parallel isn't just a matter of inconvenience, it's a fundamental barrier to growth and settlement. In the absence of reliable roads or railways, the North depends on two fragile lifelines: AIR transport and seasonal ice roads. Across the country, there are 300 public airports, but only 70 serve as dedicated fly-in points for remote communities. For much of the year, these isolated towns rely on aircraft for every shipment of food, medicine, and fuel. The cost multiplies quickly. Shipping goods by air can be 4 to 6 times more expensive than by truck. In Tuktoyaktuk, the price of a standard basket of groceries is about 20% higher than in more accessible communities, even after accounting for the seasonal window when ice roads open and trucks can roll in. When the ice melts, planes take over, and the price gap widens. A logistics coordinator in Nunavut puts it plainly: every bag of flour, every can of soup, every package of diapers, if it's not on the annual sea lift, it's in the belly of a plane. And that means someone is paying the freight. Healthcare faces the same challenge. Medevac flights are often the only way to get patients to hospitals equipped for emergencies or specialized treatment. Each medevac can cost more than $15,000, a figure that strains community budgets and forces tough choices about who gets care and when. These expenses aren't occasional. They're routine, woven into the fabric of life above the tree line. The high cost of moving people and essentials by air is a constant pressure, shaping not just the price tags in local stores, but the long-term decisions families make about whether to stay or leave. The first European presence in Canada did not arrive as settlers with plows, but as traders with ledgers and muskets. In the 17th century, the Hudson's Bay Company began laying down a network of fur trading posts along rivers and coasts, each one a node in a commercial web stretching from James Bay to the Arctic. These posts, Fort Edmonton, Fort Simpson, and Moose Factory, were never meant to anchor towns. They existed to funnel beaver pelts and fox skins to European markets, drawing indigenous trappers into seasonal exchange, but leaving the surrounding land largely untouched, by permanent European settlement. The pattern was clear. The posts hugged waterways, and the population remained sparse, with only a handful of traders and clerks overwintering each year. A century later, the country's bones were set in steel. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 stitched a narrow corridor across the south, running from Vancouver through the prairies to Montreal and Halifax. Towns sprang up at rail junctions: Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, each one a stop on the line, each one growing because the rails made it possible to move wheat, lumber, and people across vast distances. But the railway's path was deliberate. It skirted the Canadian Shield's rocky interior and bypassed the northern forests and tundra, reinforcing a southern spine of settlement that persists to this day. The vast boreal and Arctic remained beyond the reach of easy transportation. Their populations measured in dozens, not thousands. Colonial policy locked this pattern in place. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 offered settlers parcels of 160 acres on the open prairie, but excluded the Shield and the North, where farming was impossible. The land rush that followed filled the southern plains with towns and farms, while the northern half of the country remained a patchwork of trading posts, trap lines, and indigenous territories. Provinces gained control over the fertile south, while the federal government kept the resource-rich but sparsely settled north under its direct authority. An archivist describes the legacy. The population map you see today, the dense southern band, the empty north, was drawn by decisions made in boardrooms and mapped along rivers and rails. The fur trade and the railway did not just move goods. They drew the lines that shaped where Canadians would live and where they would not. A digital map of Canada, layered with Indigenous territories, reveals a different kind of occupancy, one that does not show up in census counts or city lights at night. Across the north, west, and interior, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have shaped the land through networks of movement, stewardship, and governance that challenge the idea of emptiness. In the Sa-Tu-To-Ain Dene territory, the Sa-Tu-A Biosphere Reserve stands as the world's first Indigenous-managed UNESCO site, its boundaries drawn from oral histories and mapped routes of seasonal travel. Family hunting grounds, fish camps, and berry-picking sites form a living web, marked not by fences but by stories and respectful agreements between neighboring nations. A mapping representative from Native Land Digital describes how these layers overlap. What appears empty on a population map is actually full of meaning, memory, and use. Their maps show family areas, animal birthing grounds, and the trails connecting them. The land is not divided by property lines, but by relationships. Modern land claim agreements, like the 1993 Nunavut Agreement, have redefined governance over huge stretches of Arctic and subarctic territory. Nunavut itself covers over 2 million square kilometers, almost a fifth of Canada's landmass, governed through Inuit self-determination. These agreements recognize that stewardship does not require dense, permanent towns. Instead, Inuit and First Nations communities maintain mobility, moving with the seasons to follow caribou, fish, and birds, and keeping cultural ties alive through travel and gathering. Digital tools now allow Indigenous knowledge keepers to document seasonal use, traditional place names, and routes that cross what colonial maps label as wilderness. These living maps challenge the notion that low density equals vacancy. They show how occupancy can be dynamic, spread across vast distances, and rooted in cycles of return rather than fixed settlement. The land supports life in ways that census numbers cannot measure, and its governance reflects a model where presence is defined by stewardship and mobility, not by population density or urban grids. Iqaluit, perched on the southern tip of Baffin Island, stands as Nunavut's capital and the largest community in Canada's eastern Arctic. With a population hovering around 7,700, it serves as the region's administrative, medical, and transportation hub. Yet even here, where the scale and resources dwarf those of smaller hamlets, the costs of building and maintaining a city on permafrost are relentless. Every year, the city's budget is shaped by the realities of the ground beneath its feet. Permafrost isn't just an engineering challenge, it's a financial one. In 2021, Iqaluit faced a $45 million foundation upgrade for its core public infrastructure, a sum that would cover multiple new schools or community centers in the south. Instead, it went to stabilizing existing buildings, reinforcing piles, and retrofitting supports threatened by thawing ground. These outlays are not rare events. They are routine, recurring in cycles as the climate warms and the permafrost shifts unpredictably. The logistics of supplying Iqaluit add another layer to the city's unique financial puzzle. There are no roads or railways connecting the capital to the rest of Canada. Instead, everything from diesel fuel to drywall arrives by annual sea lift, a convoy of cargo ships that can only dock during a short summer window when the sea ice retreats. Once a year, the city's shoreline transforms into a hive of cranes and forklifts, unloading an entire season's worth of supplies in a matter of weeks. Miss the window, and the next chance will not come until the following summer. For essentials that cannot wait, air freight is the only option, but costs soar to 4 or 5 times the southern norm. A housing official describes the impact. We budget for foundation repairs every year, but the numbers keep climbing. One building might need $100,000 in new pilings. Another might need a full rebuild. It is not just homes, schools, clinics, even the airport need constant reinforcement. These pressures ripple through the city's finances. The price of a single housing unit in Iqaluit can reach $500,000 or more, driven by the cost of shipping, specialized construction, and the need for climate-resistant foundations. For families, this translates into overcrowding and long waiting lists. For the city, it means that every new project, whether a daycare or a water plant, starts with a budget line for permafrost adaptation, often doubling or tripling the expected cost. Despite its role as a regional hub, Iqaluit's experience highlights a simple truth. Even where resources and population are concentrated, the North's physical realities dictate the pace and price of growth. The city's struggle to keep up with thawing ground and soaring freight bills offers a window into the broader financial challenge facing all northern settlements, regardless of size. In Grise Fiord, Nunavut, Canada's northernmost hamlet, daily life unfolds under conditions few outsiders can imagine. The settlement holds fewer than 130 people, surrounded by mountains and sea ice, with no roads connecting it to the rest of the country. The only way in or out is by plane, weather permitting. Flights can be delayed for days by storms or fog. And every arrival is a community event. For residents, the cost of this isolation shows up on every receipt. A carton of milk can reach $15, a bag of apples $12, and basic staples like flour or rice cost 2 or 3 times what they would in Ottawa or Montreal. On average, food prices are 30% higher than in Iqaluit, which is itself already among the most expensive markets in the country. An elder, born before the era of regular flights, describes the shift. "When I was young, we hunted for everything. Now, we still hunt, but the store is our backup. If the plane doesn't come, shelves go empty. Sometimes you wait a week for eggs or fresh bread. The annual sea lift brings in bulk supplies during the brief summer thaw, but it's a one-shot opportunity. Miss it, and the next shipment won't arrive for another year." For everything else, medicine, diapers, fuel, even mail, the community relies on AIR freight. Each kilogram is carefully weighed, each delivery carefully tracked. Housing is another daily struggle. Building materials must be flown in or shipped by sea, and construction can only happen in the short window when the ground is stable and the weather is mild. The hamlet's homes are perched on adjustable supports to cope with shifting permafrost, but repairs are costly and slow. A single foundation fix can run upwards of $80,000, and waiting lists for new housing stretch for years. Overcrowding is common, with multiple generations sharing small spaces. Yet despite these hardships, families stay. Children go to school in a low-slung building warmed by oil heat, elders gather to share stories and teach Inuktitut, and hunters set out across the ice, carrying on traditions that have anchored the community for generations. The hamlet endures, not because life is easy, but because the ties of family, culture, and land run deeper than the challenges. One elder puts it simply, "We know this place is hard, but it's ours. We live together, we help each other, and we don't give up." The persistence of Grise Fjord stands in sharp contrast to the ghost towns that dot the map farther south, places built for resource booms, then abandoned when the jobs dried up. Here, the cost of living is sky high, the logistics relentless, and the climate unforgiving. But the community remains, a testament to resilience in a part of the country where survival depends on both tradition and adaptability. Pine Point began as a promise. In 1964, the town rose on the edge of the Northwest Territories, built to serve the lead zinc mine that would soon define every aspect of life there. Streets were laid out in neat grids, lined with schools, a hospital, a swimming pool, and rows of identical houses. At its peak, Pine Point counted nearly 2,000 residents, miners, teachers, nurses, and their families, drawn by steady pay and the sense of a permanent community carved out of the northern wilderness. A former miner remembers the first winter. The snow came early, and by December the sun barely rose above the trees. But the mine ran day and night. "We thought we would be here forever." The company store stocked fresh fruit flown in weekly, and the arena echoed with the sound of skates. For a generation, Pine Point was a full-service town, connected by rail to the south and by a sense of shared purpose to the mine at its heart. But the town's fate was tied to the ore beneath it. By the late 1980s, global lead and zinc prices had slumped. The mine's reserves dwindled. In 1988, the company announced the closure. Within months, the mine shut down, the railway stopped running, and families packed up and left. The school closed its doors, the hospital emptied, and the houses were boarded up or hauled away. Pine Point became a ghost town almost overnight, its streets abandoned, playgrounds silent, and streetlights flickering over empty lots. The physical traces lingered for years: concrete foundations, rusting playground equipment, and the shell of the old community center. But the economic scars ran deeper. The sudden loss of jobs and services forced families to scatter across the Northwest Territories and beyond. For many, the memory of Pine Point is bittersweet, a place where friendships were forged and lives were built, then uprooted by forces far beyond their control. Cleanup of the site continues to this day. The federal government and former operators have spent millions remediating tailings ponds, removing contaminated soil, and monitoring groundwater. The cost of erasing a town is measured not just in dollars, but in the weight of lost opportunity and broken community ties. Pine Point's story stands as a warning. When a settlement's existence depends on a single resource, its future is always uncertain. The promise of prosperity can vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind empty roads and a cautionary tale for those who would build new towns on the shifting ground of boom and bust economics. For policymakers, the lesson is stark. Extraction can bring jobs and infrastructure, but it rarely builds lasting communities. The volatility of commodity markets, the high cost of northern operations, and the challenge of environmental cleanup all combine to make permanence elusive. Pine Point's faded street signs and overgrown lots are a reminder that the North is filled with stories of ambition and abandonment. The true cost of resource-driven settlement is counted in more than just dollars. It is found in the echoes of towns that once buzzed with life, now silent under the northern sky. Federal officials in Ottawa face a dilemma as wide as the country itself: how to maintain a meaningful presence across nearly 10 million square kilometers when most of that land is empty of cities or highways. The Northern Strategy, updated in 2022, sets out a handful of priorities: funding new infrastructure, strengthening Arctic sovereignty, and partnering with Indigenous governments. But the numbers tell the story. Each kilometer of paved road in the north can cost several times more than in the south, and the expense of building a single fly-in airstrip can reach tens of millions. Yet the federal budget for northern infrastructure remains a fraction of what's spent on the urban south. Canada's strategic outposts, like the research and military station at Alert, Nunavut, show what's at stake. Alert sits just 817 kilometers from the North Pole, making it the northernmost permanently inhabited place on Earth. Staffed year-round by scientists and military personnel, the station exists not for comfort or convenience, but to assert Canadian presence in a region where sovereignty claims are measured by who lives, works, and maintains the flag through the polar night. Every supply run to Alert by air over thousands of kilometers costs a fortune. Heating, communications, and emergency services are all magnified by distance and cold. There is no economy of scale here, only the logic of strategic necessity. A senior official describes the challenge. We're responsible for a fifth of the globe's Arctic territory, but our population is tiny and scattered. Every dollar spent in the north has to stretch across vast distances. We can't build a hospital in every hamlet or a highway to every bay. But if we don't invest, we risk losing our foothold politically, economically, and even legally. The Northern Strategy's pillars are transportation, resource development, environmental protection, and Indigenous partnership. They are tools for maintaining that foothold. But the reality is that funding rarely matches the scale of the land. For every new runway or weather station, there are dozens of communities waiting for basic services. The vastness of the territory means that even the best-funded projects become thin threads across a sprawling map, leaving much of the north connected only by policy and presence, not by roads or rails. This tension between ambition and capacity defines Canada's approach to the north and shapes every debate about its future. By the middle of the 21st century, the Arctic's icy barriers are beginning to thin, but the consequences are anything but simple. Each summer, the Northwest Passage, the storied sea route through Canada's Arctic archipelago, remains locked in ice most years. Yet climate models now suggest that by the 2050s, this passage could open for commercial shipping every other year, dramatically shortening routes between Europe and Asia. The prospect draws headlines, promising new economic opportunities for northern communities and global trade. But the same warming that clears the sea ice also accelerates the thaw of permafrost on land, turning solid ground into a shifting, unpredictable base. Shipping seasons, once measured in weeks, now sometimes stretch to months in late summer, allowing more goods to reach isolated communities by sea. For a handful of coastal towns, this means a brief window when freight costs drop and supplies can arrive in bulk. Yet the benefits are sharply limited. Inland, where roads remain scarce and permafrost underlies nearly every building, the ground itself becomes less reliable with each passing year. Engineers report that foundation failures are increasing, while insurance premiums for northern construction have soared. In Tuktoyaktuk, sections of coastline now erode by up to 10 meters a year, threatening homes and forcing some families to relocate. Adaptation has become the new baseline. In Iqaluit, Builders install adjustable pilings and thermal siphons to keep foundations stable, while researchers monitor ground temperatures with embedded sensors. Across Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, communities experiment with elevated housing, modular greenhouses, and new insulation materials, each solution adding tens of thousands of dollars to project costs. The price of a single home shipment to the far north can exceed $50,000. And even basic groceries remain out of reach for many. Nunavut now imports over 90% of its food, relying on annual sea lifts and costly air freight. The opening seas offer a glimpse of opportunity, but the risks on land multiply just as quickly. For every promise of cheaper shipping, there is a warning about thawing ground and vanishing coastlines. In the north, adaptation is not a choice, it is a necessity, and the margin for error grows thinner with each season. Canada's vast, untouched spaces aren't just empty. They are shaped by centuries of policy, climate, and culture, and their future hangs in the balance. As climate shifts and resource pressures mount, decisions made now will redraw not only maps, but ways of life. The North's next chapter isn't written yet. It will be defined by those ready to listen, adapt, and imagine new possibilities. What future do you see for these silent frontiers?